We're just waiting to go live on YouTube. We have over 200 from the LSE community with us.
James, we're good to go.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. I'm James Putzel. I'm Professor of Development Studies, and on behalf of the LSE and the Department of International Development at the school, I welcome you to the first of this year's series, The Cutting Edge Issues in Development Thinking and Practice. We are live. I want to remind everybody that we are recording this session. We are live streaming on YouTube. I'm co-convening the series with Duncan Green, Professor of Practice in International Development. We really have an extraordinary lineup this year, which you can see a bit of in the poster behind me. Next week, Ha-Jun Chong is speaking to the issue of, he's speaking to the political economy of Parasite, the movie. Gabrielle Palma is coming to talk the following week, titled, Why the Rich Stay Rich No Matter What. We're joined by Claire Short in the following meeting, who will be talking about aid. Former and founding Secretary of State for the Department for International Development, now defunct, and she'll be reflecting on that. Mushtaq Khan is joining us from SOAS. Actually, he'll be speaking from Bangladesh and speaking about new approaches to fighting corruption. Jayati Ghosh will be speaking about the pandemic and the corporate control over pharmaceuticals, over the vaccine and the vaccine release. We have Agnes Kalibata, the head of the Green Revolution for Africa, who will be joining us in the series, Ingrid Sinath, and we'll be finishing this term series with Terrace Clark and Mosharraf Hossain on the International Day of Disabled People, speaking about disability and development. So that's just this term, and we'll go on next term too, until about late February. So join us, mark it down in your diary for 4 p.m. London time every Friday afternoon during term time. So I have to mention a few housekeeping issues before we start. Please do keep your cameras off, your microphones mute until the Q&A. Our YouTube audience this year is able to join the Q&A. So we'd like to invite you to use the chat function, which is being monitored by a member of our staff. And these questions will then be sent to us and put before the panel. The Zoom audience will also be able to put their questions in the chat, and we'll call on you to speak. And I'll say more of that about that when we start the Q&A. Now, let me start with the topic of today, where we're trying to understand what has happened in Afghanistan and what are the challenges going forward now that the Taliban has returned to power, the challenges for the nation as a whole and the challenges for women. We have quite a stellar lineup. I will only provide you brief introductions right now to them, but please, you can reference on our website their stellar records and careers. Dr. Antonio Giustozzi, I welcome you back to the LSE. For many years, Antonio was the lead person in our Crisis States Research Center. He probably knows more about the Taliban and the oligarchy in Afghanistan than many of them know about themselves. He's with the Royal United Services Institute. He's written many articles and 7 books. I'm not going to list all the books, but mention Quran, Kalashnikov and Laptop, the Neo-Taliban Insurgency, and one of his most recent books, The Taliban at War, which I really recommend all of you to read who would like to understand more the evolution of recent history in Afghanistan. So Antonio, welcome back to the school. Deniz Kandiyotti, my old friend, Emeritus Professor of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London. She holds degrees from the University of Paris, Sorbonne, and the London School of Economics and Political Science. She was also on the faculty of the Middle East Technical University and Boğaziçi University in Turkey. She's worked on Turkey, post-Soviet Central Asia, and Afghanistan, and developed comparative perspectives on state, gender, and power in the broader Muslim world. She made key theoretical contributions to analyses of patriarchy and male dominance, and she'll be able to bring those perspectives to bear today. Notable among her publications are Gendering the Middle East, Women, Islam, and the State, Gender Governance in Islam, was co-authored in 2019. So Deniz, welcome back to the LSE. Now, I'm really privileged to be able to introduce to you two Afghan women who are participating tonight. Dr. Orzala Nemat is an internationally known Afghan scholar and think tank leader. She's an expert in political ethnography, holding a PhD in development studies from SOAS and an MSc in development planning from the University College London. Dr. Nemat has firsthand experience in how it is to be a war refugee for 14 years in Pakistan. Dr. Nemat is currently chairing the Open Society Foundation's Afghanistan Advisory Board and serves on Afghan Aid, a British charity working in Afghanistan as trustee. Dr. Nemat was selected as Young Global Leader of the World Forum in 2009. And her accolades go on, but I'll stop there for the moment. And especially, I welcome Pashtana Durrani, who started her journey as an activist and human rights defender. She is now a community development expert focusing on digital literacy, SRHR, MHM, and WASH. She is the founder and director of grassroots level nonprofit Learn Afghanistan. Through Learn's project, Soraya, she has educated 900 girls and boys in Kandahar. Through Project Aisha Durrani, she has trained more than 80 teachers in digital literacy. Through Learn's project, Malala Durrani has reached out to 150 girls and trained them in menstrual hygiene management. She's speaking to us from somewhere in Afghanistan, and we're so delighted that she joins us tonight. So without further ado, unless I've forgotten anything, colleagues, I would like to turn the floor over first to Antonio Giustozzi.
Thank you. So I've been asked to try to answer this question, what happened in Afghanistan. Of course, is a very difficult, complex question to answer. And forgive me, I had to start looking back a few years to the origins of the Islamic Republic. So the Bonn Agreement, which led to the formation of a regime that we could describe as essentially oligarchic republic, where the power was largely concentrated in the hands of a number of, I would call them oligarchs, you could call them warlords, factional leaders, whatever, with insertion of some so-called technocratic elements. And I think in the insertion of these elements were the seeds of instability, as a power struggle started almost immediately between the oligarchs on one side, which kind of managed to coexist with each other relatively well, and the technocrats who, in part, were encouraged by elements of the international community, especially the Americans, to become more assertive over time, especially from 2003 onwards. And basically they were trying to gradually reduce the power of the oligarchs. And of course, the oligarchs are not particularly happy about that, and that led to a conflict that never ended and continued until the 15th of August 2021. And it was very destructive, it became more and more destructive over time. If you look at the elections in Afghanistan, how they became more and more controversial. To be honest, there was rigging already in the first elections, but things got much worse every successive election, to the point that the last election were hardly, I would say that probably the German Democratic Republic was probably more honest in running its election than Afghanistan at that point. So this was very destructive, not only because, of course, that led to essentially non-legitimate governments, where a substantial part of the political elite itself contested the legitimacy of the president, and especially Ghani, after his first mandate, became very controversial, but also because this competition was happening everywhere, at the level of the provinces, at the level of the ministries, and became more and more destructive. Essentially, over the last couple of years, the Islamic Republic already started unraveling, and already at the end of winter, beginning of spring, salaries stopped getting paid, even to the army, because the theft and the siphoning off of state funds reached the point where the priority was to accumulate funds for the factional struggle, not for keeping the army fighting, of course, in a situation where the Taliban instead were already advancing in the countryside. So state fragility was centrally there and was aggravated over time. And then the regional dynamics had a major impact. I think the Americans seem to have realized that, especially after they made clear they were going to stay for the long haul, and they started increasing their presence in the country, they didn't realize that they would have had devastating consequences at the regional level, where none of the regional powers were actually happy, except India, about the increasing American presence. And that was seen as antagonizing by all the regional powers. That was not only like, verbal complaints that were aired at Americans. Essentially, almost everybody started supporting the Taliban on one stage or the other. So the Taliban at one point were making hundreds and hundreds of millions every year, thanks to the support provided by a variety of regional powers, of which Pakistan is, of course, the most widely advertised, but Iran also contributed a lot. At one point, the Saudis were sending quite a bit of money, the Chinese, and also the Russians. And I only mentioned the most important contributors. And that's because the American intervention was perceived as very destabilizing in different ways. And of course, the interests of China and Russia in Central Asia were a factor, but the Pakistani felt that American intervention was strengthening their rivals, especially the Indians, and the Iranians were worried about American influence and the fact that, especially under Ghani, the Saudis seem to have quite a voice in Kabul, which of course for them was anathema. So this regional dynamics, of course, provided the resources of the Taliban to expand, to grow, and to become more and more sophisticated. We have to say the Taliban, of course, are quite good at adapting. And I think Nietzsche would be proud of them. The Taliban are an example of, what doesn't kill me strengthens me. And the Americans were not able to destroy them. The Taliban emerged much stronger at the end. They really evolved essentially as a military organization and became much more capable at the end. And now they are among the masters of hybrid warfare. I wouldn't say they reached the level of abilities of the Hezbollah of Lebanon, but they made quite substantial progress on that path. And then, we see in the last few months how all these dynamics intensified. We've seen how, the final month of the Islamic Republic were the result of these power struggles becoming almost paroxystic, with Ghani ordering initially the army in the Northwest not to fight because he wanted the Taliban to destroy the militias of his rival, General Dostum. and he thought that then the army could go on the offensive and destroy the Taliban. Instead, it did manage to destroy those two militias, but then the army was not able to go on the offensive, and the Taliban started spreading everywhere. And all the other power brokers, as Ghani called them, starting from Saladin Rabbani in the Northeast, decided that given Ghani's agenda, they would rather make deals with the Taliban. So one after the other, they made deals with the Taliban and surrendered big chunks of Afghanistan, first the Northeast, then the West, then the South, to the Taliban. And that, of course, meant at that point, it was all lost already. And that was all due to fighting. And even the fall of Kabul was a result of fighting with Ghani, apparently out of spite, decided not to hand power to the to a coalition or essentially an interim government. Instead, he fled the country, allowing the Afghans to enter and take Kabul, basically trying to sabotage the interim government. And which, of course, has very major implications because the Afghani control over Kabul preempted the formation of an interim or coalition government. And that, of course, is having a very heavy consequences now. So now I suppose the question is what happens next? And of course, foreseeing the future is difficult, but the Taliban didn't expect this outcome. Even on the 14th of August, we're still hoping or thinking, and they were being told there would be some kind of interim government in which they, of course, would have had a dominant position. And therefore, they were thinking that that would allow the transition, would bring with it international recognition. So they arrived at this with the Afghans in control, challenging the power and the leadership of the Southern Taliban in a situation where the Taliban will not really have a plan B. So now they're improvising. They're trying to find a way out of the mess, but they don't really know how. They are paralyzed by the internal struggles. And even at the international level, there are the kind of recognition, legitimization issues are stuck. They can't get, for now, any country in the region, not to speak beyond the region, to recognize them. That means that they don't get any aid. They don't, of course, get the government money, which is stored in the United States, and therefore they can't really run the government. And the risk now is state collapse. Of course, there is famine. I think probably the WFP will be able to contain that, but basically the medium-term risk is a collapse of the Afghan state, because of course, if you don't pay salaries, people are not going to stay there and wait for too long. And I think I spent 10 minutes now, so I'll pass on.
Thank you. We'll be able to come back to you. Orzala. You have to unmute.
I have to remember that. Thank you very much, Professor Pudzel, and it's obviously a great pleasure and honor to be in this panel chaired by you, whom I meet for the first time, but I've been familiar with your work and engaged with your writings in my own research. And also Professor Kandiyotti is my, like I always say, is my inspirational academic mother. And it's really honor also to be on the panel with Antonio, whose work I have closely followed, at least in the areas of politics in development. And last but not least, also an honor to be on the panel with Pashtana Durrani, my fellow sister from Afghanistan, who is still on the ground, remaining hopeful and committed to work for the cause of women and girls' education. I will just sort of take this opportunity to directly go into the conversation in terms of responding some of the questions posed by starting to mention that the events from the last, since February 29, 2020, in my opinion, is clearly putting under question a large number of claims and assumptions that an external intervention with the purpose of liberal peace building will result in actual institution building, democratic systems, and eventually a stronger state. And why it questions, because everything we've seen happened in August 2021 is the consequences and the results of the agreement between the United States of America on behalf of the international community, obviously, and also the Taliban's political office in Qatar. Antonio excellently discussed and referred to the history of the past and the Bonn Conference, which resulted to the creation of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan in 2001. And so I will not go too much into details, but very briefly, looking into the situation and how things have evolved, it takes me back to my research where I have looked very deeply into how external interventions are shaping power relations at the local level in the case of Afghanistan. What I highlighted in my research then was a salient characteristic of the elite definition that overlooked some typical that overlooked some elements of elite definition that exist in countries affected by conflict and with massive level of external intervention. So in some cases, probably Afghanistan is a unique case, but if we look into other countries, maybe it's not entirely. And I'm just noticing that this actually definition I've engaged with is from a paper I read by you, Professor James and Professor Dijon, where the definitions of elites are discussing about, you know, the position of valued assets in agriculture, manufacturing. These are kind of characteristics that defines elites in a country. Or, for example, those who have power in terms of, you know, their over the distribution of resources in their locality, or those who come with socio-political, you know, bases or class bases, economic or socio-cultural, and even religious bases. In the case of Afghanistan, what happens with the elite is this major factor of external dependencies, either regional or international. Both have played a tremendous role in how the politics in Afghanistan shaped and how we see it going to a very sort of an extreme way up and then dragging down in the very overnight way of seeing, as we've witnessed. So somehow this external dependency becomes like a key determinant to see that the level or the size or the amount of this dependency or the intensity, if I can find the right sort of wording for it, the intensity determines how they are making or acting in terms of specific political decisions. And surprisingly, or maybe not much surprisingly, what we have seen happen to the Afghan political elites in the very short period of a month, very close to fall of Kabul government is exactly this. None of our elites, in the absence of international engagement or actors backing them, resource-wise or politically, they just lost themselves, and they even forgot some dollars and money in the country and their houses or in their certain places, let alone the rest of it. And so that in itself is a lot to reflect on in terms of, you know, looking at how these are happening. Now, whether the Taliban also comes into the elite or not, I think they are not exempted from this. Antonio was mentioning about Taliban's external resources. This is a force that has much more, maybe relatively unified dependencies to the regional countries. And that in itself, in the history of Afghanistan, is always a switch between Afghanistan being a subject of major powers interventions or regional powers. So now we are, like I once reflected on the new situation, as some Taliban were framing this as an independent of Afghanistan. I said, no, it's not actually an independent. We've just entered a new phase of the same sort of occupation or invasions that we are talking about. We will be hopeful to see one day independent Afghanistan, but we are not anywhere close to that. So before going to that, I just wanted to also sort of expand very briefly, using a few remaining minutes, in terms of seeing that how and why this government has collapsed as we talk about it. You see, there is a famous, well-known German poet and theater writer, who's Bertolt Brecht, who said, you know, those who don't know the truth and make a mistake, they are committing a sin. But those who know the truth and deliberately are making mistakes are criminals. Tabahkaran, I read this in Persian, so I'm translating tabahkar to criminals. So I think, to put it in very simple wording, the international actors involved in the crisis of Afghanistan, as well as the former regime leadership, have to pick which group of these two are they sort of belonging to. More sort of elaborating on the reasons of collapse, I think, as you know, I see everything through the lens of governance and how that has really collapsed. The collapse was not this overnight way of everyone finding them surprisingly in Kabul, or everyone finding themselves running away from Kabul. I mean, Taliban versus the government, it actually was more systematic. And what we have observed over the last few years, particularly after the 2019 election, or the earlier, the 2018 elections, that with all the disputes and the problems that it faced, was a very systematic, complex process of over-centralization that happened. We have witnessed and seen a very gradual but more systematic dysfunctioning of the different ministries in the Afghan government, from Ministry of Finance to even, there are examples of Ministry of Health not having the authority to declare a holiday or a break because of the outbreak of coronavirus, because they see politically we wouldn't be not looking very well. And so even health was sacrificed by that. So this collapse was not an overnight. Even if we had a sort of a scenario of a temporary government, the state was already dysfunctional because of over-centralization of power into this very private enterprise type of a government that was limited not geographically or physically to the ARG or the presidential palace, but to a very small circle of people who have monopolized the entire decision-making authority and political power over the country. So when you bring everything and make it into this very, very tiny circle of people, it was obvious that we will see this. Having said that, I also have to quickly mention about other issue that I observe, and of course these things require probably longer. In terms of ethnography, we have to have longer discussions about these things. But in terms of patronage politics, I strongly argue in my own research about how the Afghan system have been a patronage system, and it has worked and operated pre-2014 strongly through patronage politics. President Ghani, probably knowing a little bit about this, has made efforts to really disempower some of the strongmen or warlords or factional leaders that we were mentioning before. However, the tragedy of the fact is that he never thought of how to replace them. So, I mean, just a reflection in terms of those who are looking into these matters and even other contexts is that if you really don't have a strong alternative, don't touch this patronage politics, because in some way or other, probably it will have some results and not faced with the kind of crisis and situation that we were. I will just quickly end by mentioning, as I believe probably my time is over, that while we talk about the collapse of the state or the collapse of the Kabul government, we should also remind ourselves that the collapse sometimes are used in a very kind of disturbing ways. For me, like an Afghan, for example, we don't see the collapse of Afghanistan. Afghanistan as a country remain and exist, and it has its borders, it has its population. Yes, the leadership and regime change is now, I am accepting, it's part of our life. We have to see it several times in our life scale. So the key point is that we so far, every damage that has been made to state institutions is more at the very top political leadership levels. The technical and the driving machinery of the state institutions in Afghanistan are in their place, is functional, and is really probably at its best in comparison to any other time in the history. Because after all, with lots of funding and billions of dollars coming from abroad, and with very heartfully and genuine intentions of the technical people who have put their hearts into the work of building Afghanistan, building the nation, building the state, I think that's there. And our hope and desire is to not see all of this gone just because some group politically coming and trying to take the leadership doesn't want this. So the systems are there. They just need a serious political commitment to take it to make this future better than what it is at the moment. I'll take the next round to respond on Rita. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that articulate account, and it raises lots of questions for us. Now I'd like to turn to Pashtana. If you could put on your camera, Pashtana, it would be great, and unmute. And again, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank everyone on the panel, and thank you so much for inviting me. I couldn't have put it better than Dr. Nemat has already done. She is an Afghan champion for women's rights and her academic studies, and I couldn't have put it better. So I'm just going to follow what she has said and put it in a context where it's going to make sense in a rural sense, because I myself come from a rural province and from a rural district. And the reason that we personally saw that why the reason either the government in Kabul or let's say the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan was alienating, how did it happen and why did it happen over the course of these few years? I want to start with the fact that because we come from rural areas, so the only thing that our people are good at is either agriculture or enrolling in army or enrolling in the Taliban. So these are the three jobs or livelihoods that people in our villages on a village level do. So because of the drought, because of a lack of water, a lot of people had to choose sides, either go to the army side or go to the Taliban side. Now, with both sides, with the Taliban side, of course, there are regional supporters who are supporting them. The Taliban go there, they get paid on a monthly basis. And then there is the army side where people enroll and they are sent to all these other borders in the northern region, in the southern region, in the eastern region. And then at the end of the day, when they die, the only thing that comes to our district is their bodies. Now, what remains back after that, because we went through this again and again and again, because I myself lost 2,300 people from my own district. So I know how the loss is and how the feeling is. After the person is lost, we have a widow, we have their children. Now, why does the government alienate us? Because when the widow goes to the Kabul, she's harassed. She's told that this hasn't worked out. Her land is not there that was allocated to her. The money that is allocated to her is not given in some circumstances. At the end of the day, that woman who has lost her breadwinner also loses her confidence in the government. Now, that's one side of the story. The same goes for all those children that are left from all those soldiers. And these are all soldiers. These are not big generals or people that I'm talking about. These are all the people who are on the front lines fighting. Now, as I told you, because we enlist in army more or in the Taliban, that's one way of the story. You continue alienating your rural population through these policies like harassing, through grouping, through all these other means where you put people through torture and you don't give them what they deserve, what they have. That makes it dysfunctional. They come back to the rural district. They don't have a school. They don't have electricity. They don't have a hospital or a clinic, which is allocated, by the way, every year. 2 clinics are allocated to a district, at least for my, the information that I have. Now, you don't give them services. You don't give them the land that is allocated to them. You don't give them the basic right to exist as a war widow. And then you expect them to support you. How is that possible? That's the reason people started withdrawing their trust on the last government, actually. Now, that's how you function on a rural area. You already alienated all the people who actually needed that support. Now, money is coming. People are giving you a lot of money from all these sides to make schools, to make hospitals and clinics, to bring in electricity. But it's you and the elite group who is so corrupt to even look past that, to even look past the palace walls, to even address those things. Now, due to corruption, you have already alienated your rural population. You are starting to alienate your own city population or the urban population because of lack of services, the civil services or the electricity services or whatever is there. Then you start appointing people on a figurative level. You start appointing people who you think might be a good person to talk on their behalf in negotiations. I mean, like, negotiations are a place where you can talk with experience, and you forget the whole country and you figure out that, okay, a few people that are going to pay me money and are going to launch these young boys or girls careers, let's appoint them and send them to Doha. These children are all, they have studied in London, and I mean no offense, I myself studied in Pakistan, and at times I don't understand the complex situations in rural areas, so I don't want to generalize it, but majority of them don't know what is happening. They live in posh palaces, they have electricity 24/7, they have water, they don't lose people, they haven't lost breadwinners, and even if they lose, they have alternatives to either go even to the therapy. Our rural population doesn't. So you launch their careers, you send them to Doha, they don't know how to negotiate. At the end of the day, again, people are alienated through the ruler, the whole country is alienated by the negotiations because you're literally launching careers. Last but not the least, you try to harass people through their ethnic affiliations. As Dr. Nemat said, if you don't know how to play this war, don't fight it in the first place. And that's what they do. They start alienating all these minorities, all these ethnicities, all these religious minorities by actually harassing their leaders. Now, we all know what happened. Your group is also doing the corruption, but at the end of the day, you're literally doing the same thing to another person who is trying to take responsibility for their own people. Then comes the regional politics. Every other country feels like it's their responsibility to fight their wars in Afghanistan and make sure that they fight it in a way where they are not harmed in person. Now that makes our country a level field of ground where people are fighting their own wars. And I don't have to name any regional actors, but they kept on fighting. They kept on fighting on our water. They kept on fighting on people who came from Japan to help us. They even murdered them. There were people who were actually working in Afghanistan to make Afghanistan a better place. Those people were not left. And then at the end of the day, nobody takes responsibility. The money is coming, the government is corrupt, the Taliban are fighting, they are supported regionally, but nobody's taking the accountability note. Nobody's asking the questions. Where is the money going? Why is the rural population not given the services that they need? Why are the people who are being alienated not taken back in the confidence? Why are the negotiations failing? Why is it failing in the first place? And most importantly, what is happening to all these international organizations? They're coming here. What are they actually doing? What are their services, long-term, short-term? So at the end of the day, it's not Afghans failing Afghanistan. It's actually the elites, the international organizations, the donors, the Taliban, the regional partners, all of them collectively failing Afghanistan in different ways, in politics, in economics, in relationships, in diplomacy, in every other way. Now, imagine a country that has been through 4 decades of war, and you continue hitting them on every front. You hit them with regional politics. You politicize their water, their girls' education. You politicize their girls' rights. And then at the end of the day, you politicize every other thing. And then the people who are ruling them are actually corrupt. They don't even care. How is the country going to survive? So at the end of the day, as Dr. Nemat said, it's not just a military failure or it's not just fall of Afghanistan. Afghanistan never fell. It's just the fact that there is no fall of Afghanistan, but who's calling shots in Afghanistan? That's the major point. And that's what I'm trying to say. And I'm going to be very honest. It was never the army that failed. It was never the army. It was the leadership that failed army and Afghanistan. The leadership that initiated Doha deal, that legitimized Doha deal, the leadership that didn't ask for corruption, the leadership that didn't stop the Taliban when they were abusing human rights and the humans, the leadership that didn't make the political or the regional partners accountable. So I'll end with that. And that's the reason Afghanistan is actually going through all this process.
Thank you, Pashtana. Very, very moving and on the spot account. Deniz, can I turn to you.
Yes, thank you. I think that my task has been made very easy by the fact that the previous speakers have already covered enormous amounts of ground so that I can pick the bits that I think might be missing. With Antonio, we had the tension which started right after Bonn between what he calls the oligarchic forces and the technocrats. Orzala followed on looking at the role of elites and their dependence on external aid. And Pashtana did an amazing, eloquent job of looking at the multitudes of ways in which the people on the ground were alienated by regimes that were failing them systematically. To this picture, I think that I will add the missing bit of the responsibility of aid architecture after the fall of the Taliban, which we haven't mentioned. I will give you a very damning statistics provided by the economist Jeffrey Sachs. He estimates that less than 2% of US spending on Afghanistan reached Afghan people in the form of basic infrastructure and poverty-reducing services. An answer immediately to Pashtana's, there is money floating about, but where is it? A large portion of the funds were, as you know, siphoned off abroad to military and security contractor firms, to their local subcontractors, and there was, of course, a built-in corruption, which is now blamed on the Afghan elites, when in fact, it is the system in its entirety that was actually rotten through and through. If time permitted, I would give a lot of examples, but I will leave it at that. Now, the blueprint for this system was not invented in Afghanistan. It was, as you all know, applied in many conflict zones with so-called failed states. And the result in Afghanistan was far from impressive, because as a result, you have a generation later, a life expectancy of 63 years and a child stunting rate of 38%, which frankly puts flesh on the bones of what we heard from Pashtana. Aid, as you know, was counterinsurgency-led and militarized. There is a great deal of speculation and conjecture about how the Taliban was dealt with or not dealt with in the immediate aftermath of the US-led invasion, when they allegedly recognized the new government, demanded a deal. The point is, the fact remains that many provinces remained war zones where civilian populations were at the mercy of drone strikes and night raids. So we should not be overly surprised that in some regions there was palpable relief at the cessation of hostilities after the withdrawal of the United States, illustrated by journalists such as Washington Post's Anand Gopal, who specifically went to regions that were hard hit by the counterinsurgency operation. So we must absolutely be clear about the winners and the losers of the 2004 and 2021 period. The winners were mainly in major urban centers, especially in Kabul, which, as you know, experienced an aid-fueled boom. So I think that we should spend time interrogating and looking in detail at the aid architecture. I will close this part of my comments by saying that when I was in Kabul in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Taliban, after the invasion, the aid architecture was totally chaotic. You had the Japanese doing disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, while the US military were busy handing out attaché cases of money to landlords to help them in the hunt of the remnants of Al-Qaeda. So we have to acknowledge that. What to expect of the Taliban? There, frankly, maybe I have some differences with Antonio, who think that they were genuinely on the way to forming an interim government and possibly following a more moderate line. For my part, I never entertained any illusions in that respect, not because of divisions and dissensions in the ranks of the Taliban, but because of the permanent risk of being outflanked by radical tendencies. Time does not permit at this point an analysis of what is known as the Salafization of Islam in Afghanistan, or indeed in Pakistan. For that, we would need to go back to the rule of Zia-ul-Haq in Pakistan and to the alliance between the CIA, the ISI, the Mujahideen groups, with financial backing from Saudi Arabia during the fight against the Soviet occupation. I will briefly only refer to an interesting study on quite recent, 2019, I think, on recruitment to the Islamic State Khorasan province, pointing out that whereas the Taliban recruit mainly rural, madrasa-educated youths who are in their majority ethnically Pashtun, the Islamic State Khorasan cells tend to recruit men and women from middle-class families, in fact, with backgrounds not too dissimilar from those of the ruling elite, who find the Taliban's version of Islam contaminated and who aspire to a caliphate. Now, at a more fundamental level, I think we have to recognize that the roots of the Salafi jihadist surge lie in what we might call roughly as the breakdown of traditional society in the 1970s, which became in the 1970s and which intensified with the decades of conflict, discussed obviously by scholars like Olivier Roy and so on, mentioning that the rise of the Taliban is not an indicator of tradition or indigenous culture, but of the breakdown of it. Which now brings me to a vexed question we didn't touch upon sufficiently, and this is the question of gender and women. What of women? What of the future of women? On this question, I have to say that despite the PR value of the focus on women, I personally believe that the question of gender regimes of Afghanistan is one of the least understood facets of this question. This is because discussions on this question have become caught up in two parallel discourses and their distorting lenses. On the one hand, we had an interminable debate on feminism as imperialism, following the hypocrisy of invoking the desire to liberate Afghan women from the Taliban yoke as a motivation for US-led invasion. It is very clear that this is the discourse and the tendency that dominates Western academia, basically. On the other hand, we also had triumphalist and fairly uncritical celebrations of the progress made by Afghan women during a period that I had myself labeled donor-driven gender activism, on purpose to distinguish it from the women's movements of Afghanistan, which predate the US intervention and I am sure will outlive the Taliban. So we have to make very sure that caught up in these discourses, we overlook the reality of women on the ground, Orzala's reality, Pashtana's reality, and the reality of many others. So realities on the ground are much more complex. Let me tell you why I think that we have a very limited angle on the gender question in Afghanistan, because we are interpreting it through culturalist lenses that distort reality. And to close, I will give you one anecdote which has stuck in my mind from the time I was doing fieldwork in Afghanistan a long time ago. I came across a family whose daughter had been married off 9 years of age to a relative in a distant province. Now, on the face of it, you might say, there we are, child marriage, families sending off their girls, marrying them. Upon further probing, it became quite clear that the reason they had done that was to protect their daughter from being claimed by a Taliban fighter at gunpoint, which is what was happening in that region at the time. So they had married off this daughter and sent her away to protect her. And here is the misunderstood nature of so-called Afghan patriarchy. We must make a very clear point here about why it is that it's so hard to give women's rights as citizenship. Because essentially, families and tribes claim for themselves the right to control the movements and the marriage prospects of their daughters. So it is very hard for women to get rights in their own persons, which is absolutely critical to citizenship rights, which is why whenever there has been a modernizing intervention from the top down, it was an attempt to expand women's space as citizens. The PDPA tried that, even Amanullah before, and then under the governments between 2004 and 2021, we had the same phenomenon. What is clear there is that there is a tension between what the state demands and what families demand, or extended families. And what you have to understand here very clearly is that the form of patriarchy represented by kin control over women, the control of brothers, fathers, and so on, is absolutely shattered when women become war booty. And I think that's an aspect of the Taliban and IS as well that is not sufficiently underlined. The fact that young fighters of a poor background who do not have money for bride price can obtain brides at the point of a gun, which is what is happening right now. And of course, this is a phenomenal breach of Afghan cultural norms, okay? However, we must not forget that this is a huge incentive for young men, especially of modest backgrounds, because a very interesting study on masculinities in Afghanistan, which was coordinated by the Christian Michelsen Institute in Norway, looking at the strategies of Afghan male migrants, a study in fact by Aziz Hakimi, noted that a lot of migrants who were working in the diaspora in Istanbul in this particular case were out there accumulating bride price for long years, laboring, because elopement or getting a wife by any other means was a dishonor for the family. So I think we must be very clear here that there are different kinds of hierarchies at work. And to talk of patriarchy in relation to the Taliban is an absolute fallacy. It is a form of totalitarianism that goes through the control of public space and the bodies of women. But because it is a political struggle, it does not disempower women, but it also disempowers men. I'm hearing of men migrating because they have daughters. So imagining that the Taliban project is not disempowering to the men of Afghanistan with a different vision. What I want to make very clear is that we are talking about contending political projects, okay? And the reason I'm underlining it so heavily is because we're very clear about this when we're talking about political economy, when we're talking about all sorts of things. When we come to gender, it collapses. And suddenly we lapse into crude culturalist categories. So I want to stop there since it's 5 o'clock.
Deniz, you have not lost any of your edge. It's been quite a few years that I've had a chance to talk with you. And you did part of my job for me in terms of reflecting on the speakers that came before you. Let me just put a few things forward and give each of you a chance to respond before we break into Q&A. One of the things that was striking to me when I had the opportunity to visit Afghanistan with Antonio in 2005 was that this international, and I thought you put it very well, Deniz, liberal state building project has deep flaws. And that what we saw happen in Afghanistan, we could predict at that moment. You build an army of 300,000 plus, but there is no fiscal basis created in the state, entirely dependent on foreign funding and also technology and organization. So we should not be surprised that this is this is not a very powerful army. We should not be surprised when soldiers are not paid. We see the soldiers not paid in the armies built by foreigners in the Congo and elsewhere. So there's a kind of artifact that's been created that was very unsustainable from the start in terms of that interventionist project. And it's not the first one, because Afghanistan has seen many of them. And I do think it's really striking that in all these years, despite the energy of the Afghan people really mobilizing to do new things, and people like Pashtana on the ground, I find extraordinary work being done in civil society. I still kind of asked to the panel, what's the sort of economic future of Afghanistan? During this last 20 years, there has been what many of you referred to in different ways as a kind of rent economy based on aid that went in large part to foreign consultants and businesses and whatnot, hugely, but then also each part of the Afghan elites had their take on. So it'd be very interesting to know also from Pashtana, looking at the rural areas, what would be the aspiration for transforming that rural economy? And Antonio, in his book, Taliban at War, I was very struck by just trying to understand the organization as a polycentric organization, far from being a centralized organization. So when we talked about kind of the failure to consolidate a political settlement, Orzala mentioned it, when it was possible, perhaps, to approach the Taliban, when they were weakest, they were excluded. We see this kind of exclusion of different political forces and other foreign interventions too. It happened in Iraq and in Libya. And this leads to a very fractured situation in being perpetually reproduced. So, Antonio, I do wonder what you think the prospects are of Taliban itself, even before talking about the other elites it would engage with, can come together around its program to man the state. As Orzala quite rightly said, the state has not disappeared. And Pashtana, I wonder if you can say anything about the staying power of civil society. There has been, this huge kind of effort of people like yourself doing quite courageous things. They're, of course, depending to some extent on foreign resources to be able to do it, but there's been a lot of social change in the process, I imagine. And I'm wondering what it looks like now going forward. Finally, I think your insights on gender are absolutely crucial, Deniz, and it goes far beyond Afghanistan. You talked about the donor-driven gender activism. I think that is what gender in development has been so much about. Checklists and mainstreaming projects, ignoring the political economy of gender, which you so succinctly captured in Afghanistan. And I think it helps us to understand more about the stories of ISIS fighters being given brides, and we need to understand gender put into that economic context. And I'm wondering, what should we be doing as we're researching these questions as young people and young students who are studying gender and development? How should they be approaching these issues going forward? And in relationship to real life situations like what we can see, the new threats for what gains have been made by the activism of Pashtana and her sisters, new threats being faced by women in Afghanistan going forward. So let me not go on because you all said such interesting things. There's so many things I would like to interact with, and instead allow you each to return. I'm looking at the time for no more than 5 minutes, so we still have a chunk of time for Q&A. Yeah, Antonio?
Yeah, well, on Taliban policy entries, I think the key issue at this point in time is that if you look at the Islamic Republic, from the beginning was held together by the fact that the president, first Karzai, then Ghani, was the conduit for billions of dollars coming into the country. So that kept the political elite together, because for all the differences and all the rivalries, they didn't want to lose that money, and the money had to be redistributed from the very top. Now the Taliban don't have that. They don't have this flow of money coming to the top to be redistributed, and that is a problem because the centrifugal tendencies within Taliban are not offset by any kind of real interest to be together, and that's why apparently in the meetings in the past weeks, when the South leadership of the Taliban tried at the beginning to keep their Khanis out of the cabinet, Sirajuddin Haqqani was banging on the table or the desk. I don't know where it was banging, but anyway, he was shouting and basically threatened to pull out, and forced the, it paralyzed the formation of a cabinet and forced the Pakistani to intervene to mediate between different factions. So it's very shaky at the moment, and the situation is compounded by the fact that the few, basically the Taliban who are in control of the revenue that Taliban still receive, which is largely from the taxation of the drug trade and the taxation of smuggling out of Iran, contraband, they're not actually well represented or not represented at all in the cabinet, in the government. So, they don't have a very strong interest to make sure that the money that is collected in the areas in the West makes it to the coffers of the Afghan state. And they've been promised in the past already, where Taliban governors in the provinces were siphoning off funds, tax revenue, instead of sending to the leadership, they're keeping it. So I would imagine that, again, a situation like this is likely to happen because, simply they don't have much at stake at the center. So these two issues together, I think they strengthen the centrifugal tendencies. We have to see what happens if the Taliban are able to get some money from somewhere. Clearly they're trying. They are having big discussion among themselves about what to do. Clearly they're a bit out of the depths. And they are still struggling to understand entirely what is requested from them. And, this internal division also paralyzed in terms of making policy decisions, So those who were working for a coalition have been outruled, and they are in the minority now. The center of the Taliban, essentially the Taliban operate as a coalition itself. So the center of the Taliban is aligned now with the hardliners, simply because they didn't think they could manage without having the hardliners on board. Because hardliners essentially are the military leaders, or the majority of the military leaders. So the leadership is not in a position to do without them, now less than ever. So, can they mobilize funds? I think they have to, but whether they are willing to make the kind of, compromises that might be required, and the compromises are different types of compromises, but the only two possible source for, a major inflow of money, because Iran doesn't have a lot of money to give away. Russia has a bit more, but is not interested in giving it away anyway. Pakistan doesn't have the money. So is Qatar, is China, and potentially Saudi Arabia, although the warming up is not there yet, although they were called about the Taliban to trying to establish some kind of relationship, but not warm enough to start paying. So that reduces really to Qatar and China, and of course both of these countries have their own demands, especially China, and the demands are quite onerous. And the Taliban know what it means. If the Chinese had to provide budget support to the new regime. In exchange, they would want to have very favorable conditions for the investment in Afghanistan. Basically, the Taliban would have to sell out. And that is something that they're reluctant to do. It's something they're considering as a last resort, but they would be disinclined to do so. The Qataris are worried about the image. They don't want to be associated with a regime that is controversial. So they are warning them. They want them to sort the image out, but it's difficult because at the same time, the Taliban are actually objectively facing very difficult situation on the ground. You know, they are facing already another war with Islamic State. They had a mini war in Panjshir, and they have to control the country with limited resources. You know, they have maybe 70,000 mobilized men to control rather large country and big cities. You know, and that's that means much of the country is very thinly garrisoned by the Taliban. And of course, they don't have a police force, so it's even harder. You know, when you control a city with a military force, they don't have the skills of a police force. So, and they're also very heavy-handed. So we're seeing already that in dealing with the Islamic State, the Taliban are resorting to death squads, essentially. You know, so rounding up suspects and they can then disappear or reappear dead. So that is likely to compound the situation.
Thank you. Let me pass on to Orzala, please. And yeah.
Thank you. I will very briefly refer to the question of, what can be expected of their return in terms of Taliban power and to some of the points that were already made earlier. But before other points with regards to women and women's struggle, I want to sort of, from my own position, reiterate the point I have always made back in the earlier years, that when I was faced with this question, where will women be in the absence of international funding, international support, I always made that point very clear to internationals. I think I don't need to make it clear to my own Afghan fellows because everyone is witness to this. Some see it, some close their eyes, but that's a reality, that the struggle for women's rights is not a new phenomenon in Afghanistan. This is an ongoing struggle. The intensity of it, the speed of it, the scale of it differs from time to time in the history, but it would never be stopped. And examples of that and examples of a post-donor-driven gender activism is already seen in the streets of some cities by women trying to very peacefully, without any arms, without any aggression, are using their rights to basically demonstrate or protest, asking for their rights to have jobs, to have access to education, and so forth. Taliban's ruling in the past 1.5 months, although they keep insisting that they need time, it's a military government at the moment, so Hukumat Nizami, and that means mostly don't expect much from us. We are just there to maintain some level of law and order. But their actions towards women in itself requires a little bit of attention. Undoubtedly, Taliban, typically in terms of what they are identified with is this issue of women. But it's not only themselves trying to fall into this trap, but also internationals always are obsessed with Taliban's position on women. They themselves give them enough evidence to think so, but I think as a result, what we are seeing now is more towards the whole issue of women's rights, women's position in the society. Girls' education as a basic right is becoming a bargaining chip. And in my sort of reading, I think it's more used as a bargaining chip to basically pressurize the international community. This is the leverage the ruling power has over the international community. There are no longer bases, there are no longer troops. They cannot pressurize some individuals or some organizations in the country. All are gone and evacuated. They just take the woman hostage in some ways and try to pressurize the international for their demands. So what is the results? What could be done? I think what is critical is to make a very clear distinction between engagement and endorsement or political or formal diplomatic recognition. There has to be a distinction between the two. I'm very pleased to hear the Qatar foreign minister showing some concerns about how they are disappointed on some of the Taliban action. I think they are listening. If they don't listen to the Western allies, they should listen to the country that was hosting and feeding them so well for the last few years in Doha in Qatar, the leaders. So I hope that they will listen to that. And it's not a matter, they can have any kind of pressure or any kind of negotiations with the international community, but they should not play with the life of the future generations of Afghanistan, who, particularly the girls who are deprived of their rights to education. So they have basically two choices. Either they become and remain as restricted as they are, and we read that as a way of seeing their ruling lasting not too long, or engaged and be more open to discussions, conversation, and particularly on issues of concerns of the half of the population, and then the situation may change. So it's a very critical situation to see it in that way. I have one comment to make also in terms of, looking into women's struggle or civil society's struggle. Again, civil society is very similar to women in my view. We have a very vibrant and strong civil society. Nearly none or very, very few of the civil society people have left Afghanistan. Majority are in the country. They are in rural areas. They are in urban areas. We talk to them. We are communicating with them. And this idea or this notion that everyone just leaves the country is just bizarre. Yes, people left the country. Some are on the way to go out. And they are going not because they are dying to go out of Afghanistan and leave their house and life and livelihoods. They are thinking of leaving the country because of economic situation. So what would be potential sources in the absence of the massive international funds or donors fund? I think we need a transition phase that could cover the immediate humanitarian aid with key lessons to be learned from the past. We need to cover this transition period in terms of, looking more following more forward-looking policies that can ensure that there is zero tolerance for any kind of dependency. And it's more forward-looking in the sense that makes the country and its economy more self-sufficient. So it sounds a little bit idealistic now to talk about that, but I think it's our best way forward. And finally, not last but not least, my advice to younger generation who are interested in studying gender is to really highlight the notion of agency. I think I'm not a gender expert, and I'm embarrassed to speak in presence of Deniz about this, but it's really something critical. And we've had a lot of discussions about this in the course of my own, studies and learning, that it's critical to not consider women, even in the worst circumstances, like in some instances, in some parts of our history, as helpless and passive victims. They've always made that agency. And I think that would turn the perspective towards studying patriarchy, studying gender, studying masculinity. That will change really the perspective in terms of, learning and reflecting more. Thank you.
Thank you, Orzala. Pashtana.
Thank you so much for the answers. Dr. Nemat, she put it right when she says that when it comes to Afghan women, we shouldn't be reduced just to one of those tools that could be studied or looked through a lens, but rather we have our own points that we are and our own lives to take agency over. Adding on to that point, and then coming to the economic growth and future of Afghanistan, I just want to give an example. My grandmother was the first wife of my grandfather, and my grandfather remarried again because my grandmother was used to talk back. So my grandmother was like, okay, I'm going to leave the house. And she left the house. She took the children, she educated them, she put them through schools, through colleges, she made them independent. And then she educated her daughter. She marries her off and she lived as a single mother. And this is not in the 60s, it's in the 40s, where some regional countries didn't even exist, by the way. So she does all that on her own in rural Afghanistan, where she's daughter of a chief, married to a chief, and now is living as a single mother. Then my auntie, she's married. She is facing domestic violence because she's married into another tribe, and because of the tribal feuds and everything, she is like, every day facing domestic violence. She goes on, she files for divorce. She loses her children custody, but she gets the divorce. She moves on, she studies, she becomes a teacher, and she contributes to the society responsibly and becoming a responsible citizen. The reason that I'm giving you these details, normally people are ashamed to give these sort of details. We tend to hide the reality. Okay, my grandmother left my grandfather and she just raised them on her own in rural Afghanistan. My auntie, she was my father's sister. She was divorced and then she remarried and she studied and blah, blah, blah. So the reason that I'm stating these are the late 70s and the late 40s that I'm talking about. And these ladies made it to that possibility of surviving. Even if my grandmother was not educated in schooling, she was educated only in Arabic and Pashto, and she could only study Quran and Qudri. So the reason I'm stating this, back in the day, she did two jobs, one in agriculture and the second was mending things. Although she came from a very posh family, but she did it to get through the day, to put her kids through the school. Now today, when looking at Afghanistan, we are once again going through the same phase. But at the moment, people who are in rural areas need the following things. They need, what do we call it, seed money or seed funding. It's not big money. Afghanistan was never saved by big money, because the big money that came to Afghanistan would have made Afghanistan richer 3 times. We would have developed 3 countries with the money that came to Afghanistan, with the way I look at it. So at the moment, we don't need big money. We need the right money that goes to the people, through the right channels. A family of 30 people I'm in touch with, we are helping them buy a zaranj, which is like, automobile rickshaw, where they can transport goods from one way to another. That boy, I'm going to buy him that zaranj only if I talk to him and talk him through the whole thing. If he's going to commit to sending his daughters to school. He has 2 daughters. And he said, very well, it was in the morning when I did it. I know it's bribing, but it's helping, it's working, right? So it's putting the right money in the right place and asking the right questions. Tomorrow, in 10 years, maybe Pashtana won't be to help. Pashtana might have her own life. And then this guy who have put his daughters through schools and his sons through school would be able to help with normal jobs like teaching, like tutoring, like doing their agricultural work. I'm not saying make women ministers in Afghanistan all of a sudden, because that's not going to happen. As Deniz said, the way we look at gender is way different than the way world looks at our gender politics. So we have to understand we need women in working spaces on a very basic level. And this is how we do it. The second thing that we need to do is the fact that, okay, this is how we empower the rural communities through giving them that seed money or the right money that they need, or the right services, to be honest, at this point. The second thing is the government shouldn't be used as a policing tool. It's not a policing tool. It's there to serve the people. It's there to give the service. It should be giving them electricity. It should be giving them clean water. It should be giving them schools, clinics, instead of politicizing the layers that I'm going to wear when I'm going out, or the sort of heels that I'm wearing, or the way I'm talking, or the perfume I'm wearing. This is not how the world works. In 5 years from now, Taliban may be in power and the Taliban may not be in power. We thought Ghani is going to be here for the rest of the 5 years, but he wasn't, right? So in 5 years, we may not know that the Taliban exists, but we know that there is a high rise and demand for girls in coding. So we should be training girls in coding right now. We should be training girls in midwifery and medicine right now, because in 5 years, we need those girls. We know that in the coming 5 years, we need girls in accounting, in STEM, in teaching, in faculties. So when you need all those things, because there will be an increase in population, girls will go to school, girls will go to universities, they will need female teachers, because at the end of the day, even after 10 years, we love segregation and we are going to stick to segregation. It's not just a Taliban thing, it's an acceptable thing throughout Afghanistan. So we need female teachers, female professors, female accountants, female STEM leaders. And for all that to start, we have to start helping those families that can actually go through their day without begging, without starving their children, because the first step towards stability is economically empowering the people on a very basic level. You don't have to give them 10 greenhouses. You have to give them one greenhouse. That's the only thing that they need right now. You only need to give them one zaranj. You only need to give them one tailoring kit for them to survive, because that's how Afghan communities are. They work collectively and they survive. So I'm always going to talk from a grassroots level. I can't do macro level. In my head, I'm always doing community level. So for me, it's very important to empower the parents through technical support that we have right now. Women can do amazing embroidery. I know I have been very against embroidery in the past, and I might be even in the future. But if that's the only thing that women can do right now, support them. Afghan diaspora can, and the donors can throughout the world. The fact that we took all this money and nothing happened is the reason that we are failing right now so much. Right now is the ask and the demand for the right money and in the right places on right resources, so that they're sustainable in the next 10 years when there are no Taliban in power, or there is another government in power which is very inclusive. So we always have to think big, but also the fact that current political situation is not a long-term situation. It can be changed, it can be challenged, it can become inclusive, it can become exclusive. We always have to look at a plan B and plan A, but most importantly, there should be sustainability. I don't mind who is in ARG, as long as women get to go to work, they get to go to schools, they get to contribute to the Afghan society as they used to in the 70s, in the 60s, and even in the 2000s. So I'm going to end my talk with this. Thank you.
Again, very striking. Deniz.
I feel that our audience has been so patient.
Yes.
That I might hold off at this point and take questions. I have two very brief points about the resilience of civil society and one more point, but it'll come out, I'm sure.
Yes.
So why don't we proceed?
Please come back with those.
Okay.
And so we have now John T. Would you like to read the question?
Yes, hello. John is unfortunately stuck in the library and has asked us to read his question. So John is asking, based on the writings of Sarah Chase and Aisha Ahmad, it seems that the obvious and glaring issue with the government of Hamid Karzai and Ashami Ghani for many Afghans was one of double taxation. So for most farmers and merchants, agents of the state empowered by US forces would charge them taxes or bribes at checkpoints, only to face the same thing when merchants would cross into Taliban-controlled territory. They were taxed twice. However, as Aisha Ahmad points out, the Taliban promised a more unified tax system under their control, which would allow farmers and merchants to be able to predict their costs better and actually earn a sustainable income to feed their families. So what would a decentralized federal system of taxation and security provision have looked like that have overcome this problem? And do you believe that this could have provided the long-term legitimacy that was so fleeting for both the Karzai and the Ghani government?
Okay, I'm going to take the two other questions, and the panelists get to choose what they would like to respond to. And so we have Shivani Shukla. Could you step up and put on your camera and tell us your question?
Hi. So I'm Shivani, I'm from India. And my question is basically for Dr. Nemat and Pashtana Durrani. It's about how would they view Taliban's personalized interpretation of the Sharia law, which is now the foundation of the apparent non-liberal form of leadership. So how are they really viewing the Sharia law and interpreting it to, in a way, expand their views about being so non-liberal? And does such form of government, in an idealistic manner, I mean, if they're liberal, would that work, such a religious form of government?
Thank you. And we have a question from someone who wishes to remain anonymous. Greta?
So our anonymous listener is a student from the US who would like to ask, what can we learn from the situation in Afghanistan in terms of the effect of foreign interventions? So what can we learn in terms of both the uses and the limitations of foreign aid using Afghanistan as a case study here?
Okay, I'm going to go, and as there are many questions, I think it would be good to have rather brief responses if possible. And I'm going to start with Deniz.
Okay, about foreign interventions, I think that there has been a great deal said about non-forced interventions, of which Afghanistan and Iraq were prime examples. What is the purpose of intervention? I think that probably the phase, the sort of neocon moment of remaking the world, you know, the broader Middle East project and so on, is dead, actually, at the moment. I mean, I can't see any prospects of resuscitation of that. So I think that the types of foreign interventions that we've had, sometimes very unfortunately labeled humanitarian interventions, they could never be humanitarian interventions, is not something that we necessarily need to worry about very much, I feel. It's almost a closed chapter. I think that, you know, the very term foreign intervention, you know, is uncomfortable because it sort of assumes that you can redesign societies somehow. And of course, there is no record. I mean, the last time any kind of intervention worked in terms of creating regeneration and development was after World War I. World War II, the reconstruction of Europe, the Marshall Plan, and so on. After that, I can't think of a positive example. Maybe I'm not looking too closely, basically. I also want to say a word, even though it wasn't directed against me, on the interpretation of Sharia. Obviously, you know, I think that you have to look there, not at Sharia, because there was an interesting intervention from the United Nations Office of Human Rights. The rapporteur on violence against women was giving a sermon to the Taliban about the distinction between Sharia and fiqh, which is, you know, the school of jurisprudence and so on, and saying there are very many different ways of interpreting the Sharia and so on and so forth. So we're back again to quibbling about the correct interpretation of Islam, when in fact, out of 50 Muslim majority countries, only 18 actually have constitutions that make reference to the Sharia. So the problem again is not a theocratic one, but a political one. Why do certain countries make, I mean, in reality, apart from Iran, to a certain extent, Pakistan, there are very few countries, in fact, that have constitutions actually based on religious law. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Orzala.
Thank you for excellent questions. I think with regards to answers that Deniz have shared, I think I briefly will mention this in terms of, you know, what lessons we could learn. I think the greatest lessons that we could learn is to really, I think Pashtana mentioned something earlier that I want to reiterate, and that's to not really intensify the funding. It's not about the size of the budget that Afghanistan needs. It's whether it is the right, it's to the point and response to the need of the people or not. Our grave concern, while myself and many others within the civil society are advocating for humanitarian aid, is to see the return or the repeat of the 90s, where massive amounts of funds will arrive in Afghanistan and will not address the actual poverty. On the contrary, it will turn the people more lazy to do cash for work, or, you know, food for work, or things like food for school, or things like this. You know, the bribing tactics are sometimes good, but sometimes extremely dangerous. It destroyed the sense of voluntarism in our country in many, many ways, particularly targeting rural areas. So we have to be extremely careful me individually as a researcher, and my hope and desire is that we also organizationally through my organization, Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit, are able to function and to draw the attention of the international community to be careful and learn these lessons, even if we don't. Our hope is to continue our work, but even under the scenario that we want, our website, our resources are there, drawing tremendous amount of lessons to be learned about, working whether from alternative development to different other programs that has been, has had impacts, but has been also problematic in different ways. In terms of taxation, very briefly, maybe I use this to say that one of our senior researchers, David Mansfield, is working on a paper on taxation through opium economy and these sort of ways that it works. And one, hopefully everyone will read that paper sometime soon. One reflection I have is that it shows this whole process of taxation from the rural sort of agricultural products, in this case, illicit products, shows a sort of a unified system of taxation, which is probably unique in the history of Afghanistan, because historically, Afghanistan has not have had a very systematic way of paying taxes. The extractive approach to taxation has always been there. The return has never been there, hardly through some projects, some sort of donor-funded projects of the Afghan state, such as, for example, National Solidarity Program. This was the first time the Afghan rural sort of residents received something, some services through these kind of programs back in the communities. But in the ways that the rural taxation worked in the agricultural economy, I think it's something to look at it. I hope that Mansfield's upcoming paper will help us in giving more sort of clarity to this. And undoubtedly, I think I agree with Sarah Chase's recent article highlighting the fact that how this whole corruption was basically something that was basically made, like I like her title, that it was made in America. What it reflects is basically that the phenomenon of corruption was something that was not entirely, undoubtedly, the local players and partners played a role in it, but it was something also massively linked to the international ways of operating in countries in conflict. Contractors, the taxing, paying, and the highways and all of it, I think are things to be really looked at and considered. Thanks.
Absolutely, thank you. Antonio.
Well, yeah, so on the corruption and taxation, well, of course, we have to distinguish between different types of corruption. I think the petty corruption mentioned about, the checkpoints on the highways, although annoying, I wouldn't overstate their importance. This kind of petty corruption is not exceptional in Afghanistan. Pakistan is hardly any better, and still stands. I'm not saying it's a great, perfect functioning state, but at least it's not collapsed. So I don't think that's the reason why the Afghan state has collapsed. I think the key was this ruthless competition at the top, where essentially, month and months of salaries of the army were siphoned off, in part to fund the retirement of the political elite, but also to fight each other. The elections, the way they were fought, buying votes, bribing officials to stuff ballot boxes, they're expensive. You had to spend tens of millions of dollars to win an election, probably even just to run, to be a serious competitor in the election. It would cost a few tens of millions of dollars, and to win even more, because of course to win you have to be, ahead of the lot. And that, of course, stimulated corruption. And of course, many of the top actors in Afghan politics, they are running armies. These militias cost money. They have to pay their men, they have to equip them. You can speak to any smuggler of weapons in Afghanistan, will tell you, who his clients were. The Taliban were one client, the others were the militias of the various political parties. Then they use them to bully voters to follow, their indication. So that on corruption. In terms of intervention, surely this type of intervention aimed at nation building, as they say in America, which I think is doesn't make any sense. You can't build somebody else's nation. Nothing, they didn't even try actually to build a nation. I think nation building is a misnomer for state building. They didn't even manage, of course, to build a state. That kind of intervention probably is gone for quite some time, but intervention still goes on. Think of Mali. Mali is a little Afghanistan, and it's going on, and is in deep trouble, of course, and it faces problems very similar to what Afghanistan experienced, just that because of the scale of the country is smaller and the scale of intervention is also smaller, it doesn't make the headlines as much. And of course, the French are the ones who are most deeply entangled there, as opposed to the American in this case. But it will surface again some type of intervention. I think it will be different in the future. The thinking now, and this thinking might go nowhere, but the thinking is, can we actually learn? Can we actually do something to help key governments in key areas to at least develop their own armed forces and look after themselves? Because one of the lessons of Afghanistan is that we can't. And for me, the biggest lesson of Afghanistan has been not that Afghanistan was difficult to manage, but was the level of dysfunctionality of our own governments, which today perhaps is pretty obvious. Just go to a petrol station to realize that. But in 2003, for me, was a discovery. The degree to which our state were already losing functionality and the ability to actually manage even basic aspects of intervention abroad, for me, was striking, was a revelation.
Thank you. Pashtana.
I think all our panelists put it right and in the right order, so I wouldn't take a lot of time. I would start with the Taliban and the Sharia law question from Shiwani. As a Muslim, as a Sunni Muslim, I just don't want to generalize it for everyone. As a Sunni Muslim, as a Pashtun from Afghanistan, for me, the most, it's not the liberal way of Sharia or how it could make Afghanistan more peaceful or something like that, because that's not how Islam works. For me, it will be the more humane way, because at the end of the day, when you see general amnesty, and that's how Islam treats its war prisoners, or even after war. It doesn't, the people are not supposed to suffer. The people who have fought against you are not supposed to suffer. They are not supposed to be kidnapped in the middle of the night because they worked for an intelligence agency in the ex-government. They are not supposed to be murdered. Their bodies are not supposed to be missing. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in Islam, when they used to catch the war prisoners back in their day, so the Prophet would instruct the Sahabas to actually educate these war prisoners, so that later on, if they were educated even more than the people who fought the Sahabas, they would actually teach them. The war prisoners would teach the children of all these in these areas where the Muslims led. So for me, it's just questioning the fact that when they use their own ego and their own sort of ideology, and then use Islam to make sure that they pass everything, whatever comes to their mind. For education to be politicized, for people who have been in the ex-government to be targeted, for women to suffer, are sort of things that Islam never even in the first place said that you are supposed to do that. Those are all un-Islamic things, and from the study that I have done. So that's the first thing. It's the inhumane interpretation of Sharia right now that Afghanistan needs, that would make it more inclusive and more livable society. It's not the liberal part that everybody is running towards to. It's the livable part. It's surviving part. It's a survival thing that we need as a country. I mean, I have family members, female members who haven't been out of my house in 10 years, and they're fine with it. I'm not supposed to be telling her to go out, because that's how she feels. If somebody wants to go out on her own with her own protection, whatever her agency is, that's how the country right now should be. She shouldn't be whipped for wearing heels, for having layers of clothes, or whatever her ideology is. So we always have to look at Islam as how they interpret it, but also at the fact, is it their ego talking, or is it actually Islam and Sharia talking. That's the first thing. The second thing that I want to talk about is the taxation, because it's something that has happened throughout Afghanistan, especially the southern region. He was a general, and he died, and he's no more, and he was targeted, of course, by the Taliban. And his brother used to collect taxes throughout the southern Afghanistan on borders. So all the money used to go to him. All these big businessmen used to pay him ransom every month or every week to keep their business going. In return, they used to tell them that, okay, we're going to protect you. But if they didn't pay the money, they were murdered, or their family members were murdered, or they were actually removed. So I'm not going to say, okay, Taliban are bad people, but the ex-government was not. In this war, nobody's clean. Everyone has a dirty side, and everybody has played that side when they were in power. So I won't side with any side except the Afghan people who have suffered because of the taxation of the Taliban and the people in government. So that's what they did in the cities. Now, when you come to rural areas, the Taliban would ask for ashar, where you do cultivate the land, and you have to give the 30% to the Taliban. It depends on the percentage, on how much you can afford. And you have to give it to the Taliban. In return, they will say, okay, we're going to protect your business, or whatever, justice, or whatever you need. If they did it in the first thing, they would be forced, they would be murdered. Again, now it's not about the fact that did they offer those, as Orzala said, did they offer services? Did they give back anything when they were taking all that taxation? They didn't. All they did was use taxation as a ransom to make sure that they have a retirement plan in place, as Antonio said. So in Afghanistan, taxation has always been sort of seen as in, what do we call it? In the regional countries, they use all these sort of names for it. But in Afghanistan, it was literally used to either give the money or give your life. That's it. And Afghans suffered. Normal Afghans, elite Afghans, rich Afghans, poor Afghans, everybody suffered, and they're still suffering. So when it comes to corruption on all these levels, people are already paying bills, but they're also paying taxation to all these entities. And I guess that's it. But also on the foreign intervention, that's the last thing. For me, it's amusing when people say a foreign intervention, or how do you see it, or what lessons are learned. If a foreign intervention is followed up by military, it's never a solution. It's never going to be a solution, because it's going to be followed up with human rights abuses. It's going to be followed up with people being alienated, and it's going to be followed up with people rising it. And it's going to be politicized, just like the Taliban did. In the first, my father fought with the Americans against the Taliban in the first year in 2001 and 2. And he was like, everybody was so happy. Maruf was free, everywhere was free. But in the past 2 decades, all these drone attacks, all these human rights abuses alienated so many people that people ran towards the lesser evil, who would take their money, but wouldn't at least bomb their houses. So I'm not saying which side I'm leaning to, but it's always the military solution that is followed by an intervention never works.
Thank you, Pashtana. Thank you. I think we have time, if we're brief with our questions, to do one more round. And I know you have many more questions, and we could talk to each of you all day long. Could I call on Yasir Yusuf?
Yeah, hi. Yeah. So I'm an LSC Development Studies postgrad from Tanzania. My question for all speakers is on the topic of the resistance to American and foreign intervention. Does the speed in which the Taliban were able to take over the state have any indication on the extent of popular support or legitimacy that they have from Afghan civil society? Or do these type of discussions take away blame from failures of great power intervention in Afghanistan and failures of the Ghani government? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a very important question. And then we have Martha, who's an LSE student, who's asked a question via YouTube. Oh, good, Greta, you read.
I'm prepared. We do have 2 questions, both from Marta, who's an LSE student on YouTube, and Hosna Jahan, who's also dialing in from YouTube, and both of them are looking at this gender perspective. So Marta is asking whether she's taking a more ambivalent approach on the rise of the Taliban, and asking whether this could possibly be a normal resistance from people against the US and others, and asking whether people are criminalizing the Taliban a lot which is understandable given the patriarchal values, but is asking what your opinion is. Are they misogynists or are they grassroots fighters? So slightly more provocative way. Hosna Jahan is and acknowledging the different diversity of forms and interpretations of Islam and differences in lived visibility of religious practices. And she's asking, how do Afghan women, both in rural and urban areas, feel about Taliban's education policy this time around? Is there more support for the strict understanding of purda or seclusion, which emphasizes the separation of male and female in public spaces?
Thank you. Sorry. Deniz.
Resistance. I think this is a very difficult concept in this context because, as you can see, the so-called military intervention has had different effects in different parts of the country, basically. And the parts that were hardest hit were the ones subjected to counterinsurgency operations that created a loss of civilian life, etc. So there, I don't know about popular support, but Pashtana's term of choosing the lesser of two evils, it's more a question, I am not sure that there was a sort of generalized popular support, especially in areas which were not peopled mainly by Pashtuns. There, it was more, as Antonio explained, deals that were being struck, opting out of the Ghani umbrella and striking deals at the level of local strongmen. So I think that certainly resistance to what also, because again, as Pashtana explained, well, what you have is always gatekeepers at the local level who do their own extortion, whether it's the Taliban or whether it's the people who are empowered by the US invasion. So in any case, extortion takes place in one form or another, bribes, corruption, etc. So I think that, you know, a model of US intervention, foreign, grassroots fighters does oversimplify the model of what is going on in Afghanistan. The question of, again, you know, grassroots fighters versus misogynists, this is, you know, there has been a lot of celebration of the Taliban takeover as the end of US imperialism. And I think this is out of that copybook. I mean, you know, the Taliban may be a tad misogynistic, but hey, they defeated the United States. Yes. Now, after sitting through what, an hour and a half, 2 hours of discussion, I think that the complexities on the ground might have disabused you of these notions, actually. At least I was hoping. As for Afghan women education policy and Taliban's policy, I think that, you know, we're talking about a generation on. And basically, I feel that it's not just Afghanistan, but in all countries throughout the Muslim world, certainly in the Middle East, certainly after we saw during the Arab uprisings, there is definitely a younger generation whose exposure, aspirations, and so on are quite different from the generation that first encountered the Taliban. They are better educated, they are more linked up globally, they have different aspirations. So in the same way that certain categories of young people just cannot bring themselves to vote for Trump, you know, a lot of young Afghan people simply do not want to be told whether to listen to music or not, what to wear, what not to wear, restrictions on their mobility, and so on and so forth. I don't know how much this extends to the provinces, but there I am with Pashtana. The notion that people can choose different lifestyles in the same country, that they can be very pious and never want to step outside the threshold of their homes. And of course, what we see basically, I come myself from a country, I come from Turkey, where it is quite common to see on the streets, you know, generations of women walking together, a veiled, fully veiled girl next to her peer in t-shirts, and an older woman in a suit, and they're members of the same family, okay?
Deniz,
So-
thank you. I want to, Antonio is running off to have to.
Oh dear, I'm sorry, I'll
No,
stop
it's fine.
there.
No, sorry.
I'll stop
He
there.
has to pick up his son. And so I want to give him a chance to say a few final words, and also for us to thank him for his, and we can continue for a minute or two more. Antonio.
Thanks. Just very quickly with regard on the issue how much support the Taliban had. I would describe the Taliban as the single largest faction in Afghanistan, a country of many factions. So nowhere close, anything like a majority. It could have support of maybe 15% of the population. No other group probably has got as many, but there are a lot of groups, so a lot of factions everywhere. And I think the other faction, they are disunited. That's the difference, they've been fighting each other, undermining each other. So at the end of the day, and of course, a lot of people have been sitting on the fence, not taking sides. So in the end, in a civil war, they don't count. So I will stop here because I really need to run. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. And we hope you'll come back to the LSE again very soon. Yeah.
Thank you.
Deniz, I'm sorry if I cut you off.
No, that's fine. I mean, I was simply sort of saying that there should be a way of conceiving some form of pluralistic existence in a Muslim majority country, that's all, which in fact is what Pashtana has been talking about from the very start, giving examples going back to the 40s and the 70s and so
on. Pashtana.
I think I have said it all, and Deniz and Orzala and Antonio have put it right in order. So I don't have anything to add on that end, I guess. Yeah.
Orzala, I kind of want to give you the last word before I then close the session.
Thank you very much. Everything is definitely said. Just to quickly mention, in terms of the popular support to Taliban, I think one has to really bear in mind what happened. And I'm always reminded by this, some things are making a mark in your minds. And for me, post August 15, immediate first reaction from the Taliban, one of the Taliban leaders, Mullah Bradar Akhund, was this statement that he contrary to the past, he just had it directly without reading from the text. And he was like, we ourselves are surprised to the mercy of God how we reached Kabul. Undoubtedly mercy of the God on Taliban, but that I was surprised in one way. A lot of other people were surprised in another way, and Taliban themselves were also surprised. So it's really critical to know whether it was the popular support that brought Taliban into there, or it was the people's choice not to fight. I think one positive thing that happened in Afghanistan, we have at least 34 administrative divisions, we have 34 provinces, and out of 34 provinces, including Kabul, we are happy that there was not too much fighting. Only 3 provinces or 4 provinces gone through severe fighting. The rest, whatever political view that was, one day, inshallah, we will have a court to process that and figure it out. But we are happy that there was no casualties, there were no fightings. I would like to very quickly touch upon and acknowledge some form of resistance that has immediately sort of took shape as a sort of a reaction from Panjshir. And we saw that it's fading out slowly, and it's only limited to very, very high mountainous valleys in there. And there is a form of resistance, well, military armed resistance, but it became very weak. And I go back to what I was initially talking about, the extended dependencies, because we are learning that some of the leaders of this so-called resistance, military resistance that I'm talking about, are trying to take support from different countries, and they failed because no one is really now committed to pay them as in the old days. And that, to me, is, at least as an Afghan, it's a good news that at least there is not much sort of appetite for keeping the fuel of fire or of fighting. But something else happened in this resistance. The foot soldiers raise the question. So, okay, fight. You put me at the front to fight and resist. Where is your own son? Where is your own daughter? Where are you yourself? You sit in Geneva, in London, Australia, elsewhere. This doesn't work that way. So people are becoming slowly clever not to fight. And on the Taliban side, a lot of forces who are now in Kabul and in the capital cities, they're all coming with expectations, and they are not all following the same sort of probably unified position of saying that, okay, we just fought for the mercy of God and that's it. They all want power. There is lootings. There is, cars were stolen from the organizations, houses were sort of robbed and things under the name of Taliban. Some of this was robbery by thieves, criminals, and so forth. Some of them probably were by those who were promised something and they didn't breach. So the level of security and stability we see, it's not secure or ensured that it will continue for a longer time. So while there will be a very powerful and strong non-violent resistance to the Taliban, because as Pashtana said, and I want to reiterate it from other parts of Afghanistan, Central Highland, I speak to people in Hazarajat, I speak to people in the north, it's the same. No one is going to agree with Taliban policies on education. This is nothing to do with Islam. And Islam, like, this is not only my voice, but the voice of majority of my people. They say, excuse me, Taliban are existing since 94. They took power in 96. Afghans are Muslims for centuries. Who are you to come and impose your interpretation of Islam and Sharia over me, who have been generationally a Muslim person from a Muslim family? So that's why I think Taliban have to be extremely careful in not following the paths of other ideological the exclusionist groups like the communists or the PDPAs. Some of their approaches now are giving us some signs of becoming like that. You are a Taliban, you are part of the system, you are non-Taliban, go to hell, basically. That's the policy. That has to really change if they really are serious about leading the country, because what is happening now is sort of a gap or a sort of an lack of leadership. And education, particularly girls' education, is a great example of that, which we hope to see a very fast sort of action towards it, because it seems that the pressure over Taliban is also increasing, even from their own allies or people they thought would be their allies are pressurizing. I hope those pressures are continued. And then I really hope for a change. And I think everyone should really remember that this country, no matter what, will survive, will thrive. The people will not surrender to oppression or anything by force. The history showed that, and I hope the future will also ensure us a better time to discuss and see things. Thank you very much.
You know, I have to say, on behalf of all our students and all the LSE community, and I'm sure our watchers on YouTube elsewhere in the world, that we feel really privileged to have had all four of you speaking tonight, and Orzala and Deniz and Pashtana. Thank you very much. I mean, we will want to continue to learn from you. And I know that I know, Orzala, that probably David Mansfield should be talking to Pashtana about taxation. I think we had a good and in-depth conversation about the unfolding situation. And it's not altogether a depressing situation. We hear a lot of shoots of what could be possible. And I hope our students too will take inspiration from this to continue to study what's going on in Afghanistan and how the situation unfolds in the months and, of course, years to come. So thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to have you. And I remind the rest of the audience that please meet us again next Friday when Hajin Chang is coming to talk to us, about the political economy of Parasite, the film about inequality in South Korea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and the pleasure was mine. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pashtana.
Thank you.
Oh, I wonder if we lost. Try to remind.